savages or whatever, right? And so that's certainly a thing that you can say. The final thing you can mention of our little piece here is politics. This is a very simple one. It may very well be in a democracy that if you are the president, you don't care about a particular thing, and yet you're answerable to the voters, right? If the voters care about it, you sort of have to care, right? It may very well be that there are electoral reasons why, as a president, you care about a particular issue above others, right? For example, the Republican Party in the 1990s and 2000s was very, very interested in regime change in Iraq. There's this whole idea that Saddam Hussein was a uniquely bad guy and to do something about it. Part of it was that the Republican Party had been lobbied intensively by former Iraqi exiles, people who fled the country. And these people had gone to the Republicans and convinced them Saddam Hussein is a uniquely bad guy. He's not just some tin pot dictator. He's like mini Hitler. You know, he's really bad. And so a lot of Republican politicians listened to this stuff and said, "Gosh, doesn't America have a responsibility to do something about this, right?" And that became an issue that they pushed politically because they felt that it was important, right? Clinton, for example, again to use a great example, he bombed Afghanistan several times in the 1990s because the Taliban were this brutal regime that was in part mistreating women. And people argued that Clinton's attacks weren't actually very serious, but they were intended to demonstrate that he actually cared about this sort of stuff, right? That in the wake of a series of scandals involving women that led people to conclude that Clinton may not be the sort of knight in shining armor that he was portrayed in with respect to women. Here he was bombing the Taliban, this awful, odious regime in Afghanistan that mistreated women, as a way to demonstrate that, actually he sort of did care, right? And so some of this is kind of entirely cynical, right? Some of it is sort of like, look at this thing I'm doing to distract you from the fact that I'm actually bad, or whatever, right? Otto von Bismarck, the 19th century German chancellor, famously said, nothing distracts people like a short victorious war, right? Go crush some country, have a parade, everyone will forget what it is we were complaining about, right? On the other hand, it could very well be, as we'll see in this example, that you could be, as a president, you could not really have much of an opinion about a particular issue, but if 80% of the voters want you to do something, I mean, you should probably do that, right? And if not, you expect to lose the next election, right? Then maybe you'll lose because the guy running against you will complain that you didn't do whatever, right? Imagine after 9/11, if the president hadn't invaded Afghanistan, right? If you just said, well, it's not really a good idea. I'm sure the next election would have hinged on the president's failure to do something to the people responsible for 9/11, right? And I don't doubt that George W. Bush felt justified in invading Afghanistan or wanted to, but you can also argue that he didn't really have much of a choice, right? The public wanted someone to be seen as being held responsible for the 9/11 attacks. So there you have it, right? And so in a monarchy, if you're King Louis XIV, none of this matters. You do what you want, right? You're the king. On the other hand, in a democracy, it doesn't always work like that. Popular opinion, public opinion, the newspapers, the voters, they have opinions that you sometimes have to take advantage of or take recognition of. And so that's sort of what this is referring to here, you might say, right? And so having said that, let's talk now about a perfect case study that will illustrate all of this, and that is the war in Cuba, the Spanish-American War. Okay? So Cuba, the island off the coast of Florida, right, 90 miles away from Florida, that had been a Spanish colony since the 1500s, right? Christopher Columbus discovered it, the Spanish government settled it, they had settlements in Cuba, and so it's been for a couple hundred years, right? Periodically, the Cubans have revolted. Around the time of the big Latin American revolutions, the Monroe Doctrine kind of thing, the Cubans had revolted a couple times. Every time the Spanish had successfully suppressed the revolt. Turns out it's fairly easy to do that on an island, Cuba. You can isolate it from the rest of the world. There's nowhere for the rebels to go. They can't cross over to Venezuela from Colombia or whatever. And so the Spanish, despite all of the loss of their colonies, they lost Venezuela, Ecuador, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, Argentina. They lost everything. They kept Cuba. And so in 1895, the Cubans revolt again. And they're very canny in their sort of public relations strategy. They're very quick to point out that basically what they're doing is the American Revolution. We Cubans want to revolt against Spain like you guys did in, Reagan's Britain, right? 1895 to 1776. And this is an argument that is very, very sympathetic in the American press. The American newspapers are quick to sort of pick up and illustrate the connections between these two things, right? And so the Spanish are determined not to lose what they view as their last kind of really serious colony in the Western Hemisphere. The other is the Philippine Islands in the Pacific Ocean. And so the Spanish send a general, his name is General Valeriano Weyler y Nicolau, who does not sound Spanish, but trust me, he's totally Spanish. And they send him with 50,000 soldiers. and they send him to stop the Cuban revolt, and he comes up with a strategy of basically butchering anybody he can. It's so straightforward that in fact the newspapers start to call him the butcher, right? His solution is, if you're a Cuban with a gun, I kill you, and then eventually the world just will not be any Cubans with guns, and then I'll just sort itself out, right? And he comes up with a plan, borrowed from the British, of taking the Cuban population that often the guerrillas, the Cuban insurgents, they hide in the civilian population, right? Chairman Mao, as ghastly a person as he was, said it quite well when he said, for the guerrilla, the population, the civilians, they're like the ocean that the fish swims in, right? They're like the water that the fish moves through. And so what Whaler does is he starts isolating large portions of the Cuban population in camps. Which, of course, borrowing the British term, they call concentration camps, right? It's very easy. If I round all of you up and put you behind bars, you can't provide cover or aid to Cuban guerrillas, right? They can't hide in your towns and villages as civilians because you're all in prison, right? And as you might imagine, the concentration camps turn out to be death traps, right? People get sick, they die, they get illnesses, there's violence in them and all this kind of stuff. And so all of this plays out over a couple of years. And of course, the American press is watching this happen in real time, right? And so why do we care about all this? Well, the sugarcane companies are deeply interested in Cuba, an island 90 miles away from the coast of the United States of America with a developed sugarcane industry that we could take over. That sounds like an interesting thing, right? There's also this sense that, like, gosh, Cuba, having bases in Cuba, controlling Cuba would be a very important thing for dominating and controlling the rest of the Caribbean, right? So there are these Alfred Thayer Mahan-ish reasons why you care about that. And then, of course, from a piety perspective, gosh, don't we care about the Cubans? I mean, aren't we sympathetic to people who are trying to do what we did? And remember, the American Revolution only succeeded because of the intervention of the foreign power, the French, right? Shouldn't we pay it forward, right? If the French helped us become independent, can't we do the same thing for someone else? And then, of course, politically, the American president does not care about the whole thing at all. He kind of wishes it would go away. The American president at the time is your friend and mine, Ohio Republican William McKinley. Here's McKinley right there. McKinley does not really care, but increasingly large segments of the American voting public care a lot about what goes on in Cuba, as it turns out. You can see here, by the way, this is a famous picture from newspapers. This is, there it is. The stories about the brutality of the Spanish government become legion. And the thing is, the popular newspaper press is undergoing a big change in the 19th century. There had always been lots of small newspapers in small towns and cities. Most cities had multiple newspapers, and most newspapers were unabashedly partisan. They would be like, it would be literally called like the Cincinnati Republican, and so you didn't have to guess whether they were pro-Republican or not. They said so in the name. Most people would subscribe to multiple newspapers and just read them all, right? Kind of compare them together, right? And so most newspaper coverage, though, was what you would today call kind of like highbrow. It was like economics, politics, local news, editorials, business stuff, things like that. There wasn't really what you call a tabloid press. And it was really beginning to be invented around the turn of the 20th century, in this 1890 period. And so the trick is, the tabloid press needed something to cover, and as it turned out, the Spanish-American War was the perfect story, right? The big one that gets started, I want to say it's the New York World, I think, and it's started by a guy named William Randolph Hearst. Hearst will become infamous in the 70s because I want to say it's his granddaughter who becomes... No, shut up. I don't even know why I did that. Go away, watch. And so his granddaughter, Patty Hearst, becomes abducted by radicals and ends up becoming involved with these sort of terrorists in the 70s. And it's this really bizarre thing, right? So this is the guy, Hearst, right? So his father gives him a bunch of money, and he buys a newspaper. And his father's like, you're not going to make any money in the newspaper business. That's stupid, right? But Hearst comes up with this entirely new business model for newspapers. Right? Instead of trying to compete with like the New York Times, which is expensive, you have to hire reporters, it's very costly. Instead, he tries to sell a cheap newspaper aimed at, you might say, sort of lower brow readers. So instead of being complicated economic and political news, it's sort of like tabloid stuff about celebrities, stuff about crime, sort of news stories, but not sort of like complicated, in-depth investigative reporting, more like current events kind of stuff. And the trick is, you can produce it for cheaper, and you can sell it for cheaper, and you can market to people who would read a newspaper, but they don't have a lot of money to spend on the New York Times. They don't want to read the business section of the New York Times, but they would read a tabloid, right? It's a totally new market, a totally new kind of newspaper that did not exist before. world. The reason that it succeeds too is that he's able to produce it for very limited amounts of money. One of the things he does is to get cheap paper to lower the cost of newspaper. He goes to the paper mills and they throw away a lot of pulp that is dyed yellow because of the paper producing process. They throw it away. He buys it and says, make that into paper and I'll use it. And of course it's awful, cheap paper, doesn't hold ink, it smells bad, it disintegrates quickly, but it's newspapers, it's not books, so you keep forever. You read the newspaper, you throw it away. Crappy paper works perfectly fine, but when they print the newspapers, they're yellow. And so the tabloid press quickly becomes known in America as the yellow press or yellow journalism. And when you write newspaper stories that are particularly sensationalist, they often get known as yellow journalism as a result, right? Because the first couple of tabloids used this business model of printing on otherwise rejected paper, right? And so the problem with Hearst is he needs a story, right? He needs a story that will sort of give his paper something to talk about, right? The Spanish-American War, the Cuban Revolt turned out to be the thing. In the late 80s, Ted Turner started CNN. And everybody thought, okay, look, a 24-hour news network, is there 24 hours of news in a day? Like, who cares? No one's gonna watch an anchor trying to come up with something to say at 3 in the morning. And then within a couple of months of CNN starting, the Berlin Wall came down. And CNN was the only news service that had cameras at the Berlin Wall. So CNN aired live footage of German students smashing the Berlin Wall with sledgehammers, and they had people talking about it for weeks. And of course, they got a CNN reporter to stand out there and literally interview German students. Like, what are you doing right now? What does this mean? Why are you doing this? And talking to the camera. And nobody could compete with that. I mean, you could watch, they would talk about it on the ABC News, but like Ted Turner had a guy interviewing Germans. Like, what are you gonna watch, right? And literally there's a guy smashing the Berlin Wall with a hammer. I wanna see that, right? Fox News did the same thing. They really needed a news story to sell the idea of there being a more conservative friendly news network. And then right after Fox News got started, Bill Clinton started getting impeached. And it turned out, what are you going to cover on Fox News? The Bill Clinton impeachment, 20%. And like all legal proceedings, there was this constant, steady flow of information about new testimony, new proceedings, interviews with people, and it gave them this perfect story to tell over the next like 18 months, right? And so for Hearst, the thing that sold it was the Cuban Revolt. He started sending reporters down there, he started interviewing people, writing stories about it. And one famous incident, he sent a guy down there to cover the war, and the guy sent back a note saying, the fighting's kind of over, the Cubans kind of lost. And so Hearst said, you just take pictures and I'll write the captions and supply the war, right? You just give me some photos and I'll come up with something to say, right? And so the most infamous incident was the Olivet incident, which is depicted here. The Spanish had reportedly been stopping third-party ships, mercantile vessels, trade ships, cargo ships, and they've been searching them for contraband, right? Military hardware, right? Weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, cash, things like that. And the story was that they've been stopping ships because the Cuban rebels were smuggling in stuff from foreign countries, right? And so on one of these ships, allegedly, they stopped the Olivet, it's an American ship, they stopped it, and they found a woman. And she's Cuban. And they said, wait a minute, you're connected to some Cuban rebels. So they searched her cabin and her personal effects, her luggage, and then they strip searched her. Right, and so here you can see the Olivet incident in full effect. Spaniards search women on American steamers, and then here is this lady who does not look particularly Hispanic, by the way, because you know your audience, right? You're trying to sell papers in the United States, so you maybe make her look a little more Caucasian. And then notice the sort of ghoulishly criminal Spanish sailors. This guy literally is like twirling a mustache and like laughing, like right? And they're strip searching this poor innocent woman who is, as you know, just trying to help her brother or whatever. And of course, what did they do to her after they strip searched her? Well, I'm pretty sure you can figure it out, but don't worry, I'll tell you, page 5, top of the fold, right? Details inside, right? Just like film at 11, right? And of course, remember, if you're in the news business, what sells in the news business? Violence, sex violence, those are the things. If it bleeds, it leads, right? When you watch the local news, the reason that the local news or the national news seems like a horrible, frightful parade of horrors is because if Anderson Cooper comes on and says, well, nothing really bad happened today, so it was like pretty much a good day, then you're like, oh, I feel pretty good, and I'll change the channel now and watch something else, right? Yeah.
Have you ever seen that Jake Gyllenhaal movie, Nightcrawler?
Yeah, where he literally goes out and finds bad things. They literally hire people to go find bad things because the local news can't just say like, well, today was a good day, so we'll just, okay, let's change the channel now, right? And so they literally, they will pay people to go find car accidents, footage of people, crime scenes and stuff, yeah. Which is the one hand ghoulish. Well, to be totally fair, those things are noteworthy, so you would want to know about them, but there's a little bit of a kind of an ambulance chaser mentality to it, right?